It was the kind of quiet that only comes in the dead of night, the kind that wraps the world in a thick, suffocating blanket of stillness. Olivia always found it unnerving, but tonight was different. She hadn't been able to sleep for the past few nights. Something gnawing at the back of her mind, a prickling sensation that she couldn't shake off. Every evening, as the sun began its descent beyond the horizon, she would pull the curtains back in her bedroom just enough to peer out at the street below. It was a simple habit, one she'd done for years, but recently she had started noticing something strange. They were there, standing motionless at the edge of her yard, figures in the darkness. At first, Olivia thought it was some sort of prank, maybe a few teenagers dressed up in costumes trying to scare her. But as the nights went by and they returned again and again, she began to wonder if there was something more sinister at play. They always wore masks, simple white faces with hollow eyes and silent mouths. Their bodies were cloaked in black, making them seem like shadows against the backdrop of the dim streetlights. Olivia couldn't say how many there were, for they were often scattered, as though they were positioned in strategic places just far enough apart to avoid giving away their numbers. Sometimes she would see only one or two, but on other occasions there were more. She never saw them move, not once. They never waved, never gestured, never acknowledged her in any way. They just stood there, still as statues watching. At first, Olivia convinced herself it was all in her head. The shadows could play tricks on anyone's eyes, she reasoned. But no matter how much she tried to rationalize the situation, a deep unease settled in her chest, like a stone weighing her down. She began to lock all her doors and windows before bed, double-checking them, even though she never heard anything during the night. The sound of the air conditioning was louder than any footsteps that might have approached her house. Still, night after night, the masked figures appeared. It was impossible to ignore them now. She began to notice patterns, small details that made her skin crawl. They didn't just appear on the sidewalk or in front of her yard. They positioned themselves deliberately near her house, often at the same spots, night after night. The shadows in her front lawn took on an unsettling familiarity, as though these figures were watching for something specific, something only they knew. One evening, a chill settled over her that wasn't just the usual bite of the winter air. As she peered through the blinds, her eyes locked with the empty gaze of one of the figures. It was a fleeting moment, just a few seconds, but in those seconds, Olivia felt a cold shiver run through her spine. It wasn't just the figure's gaze that unsettled her. It was the way they stood perfectly still, never once shifting, even when she moved closer to the window for a better look. The feeling that something was wrong grew stronger with each passing night. She tried telling herself it was a simple coincidence, maybe some strange neighbors with a weird hobby. But deep down, Olivia knew this wasn't just a case of eccentricity. No one should be that still for so long, especially outside her house. She began to feel trapped like a bird in a cage. When she wasn't looking out the window, she couldn't shake the sensation that they were still out there, waiting, watching, lurking in the shadows. Even when she stepped away from the window to go to bed, she would lie awake, heart pounding, unable to escape the feeling of being observed. It was like they were there, even when they weren't. Their presence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. She tried to talk to her friends about it, but they dismissed her concerns as paranoia, even when she explained the details of the masked figures. They told her it was nothing more than a bizarre coincidence, perhaps some local teens or pranksters. But Olivia didn't feel reassured. Something about it all felt off, far beyond any explanation they could give her. One night, after another fruitless attempt at falling asleep, Olivia finally mustered the courage to confront whatever was lurking outside. She grabbed her phone and quietly crept to the front door, unlocking it slowly. Stepping onto the porch, she tried to steady her breathing, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind raced with the possibility of what she might find, though she couldn't shake the nagging thought that she already knew. Nothing. There was no one standing on the lawn tonight. The street was empty. The only sound, the distant hum of a passing car. She breathed a sigh of relief, but couldn't shake the sense of dread still clinging to her like a shadow. It was too quiet, too still. She glanced around, making sure no one was hiding in the dark corners of her yard, before quickly retreating back inside. But when she closed the door, she caught a glimpse of something from the corner of her eye, just for a fraction of a second. There they were, standing again, just as they always had been. Only now they were much closer, the figures, the masks, those hollow eyes staring back at her, had moved closer to the house, standing just outside her porch, their silent presence almost suffocating. How had they gotten there without a sound? Her breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't explain it. There was no way they could have moved that quickly, and yet there they were, as if they had always been there, waiting. Fear gripped her like a vice. She quickly shut the door, locking it behind her, and backed away. But her mind was racing. Had she missed something earlier? Maybe she had overlooked the figures when she stepped outside, or perhaps they had been hiding in the shadows. But even as she searched the yard, every corner, every darkened space, there was no sign of them. The street was quiet again, as though nothing had ever happened. That night, Olivia barely slept. The images of the masked figures haunted her thoughts, and every creak of the house sent her heart into overdrive. The weight of their presence lingered in every corner, every shadow. She lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this would ever stop. What did they want from her? Why hadn't they spoken? Were they even real? The next night, Olivia resolved to take a different approach. She needed to prove to herself that these figures weren't a figment of her imagination. She would keep a closer watch. So she stayed up later than usual, waiting in silence, the curtains drawn tight, but just enough space for her eyes to peer through. Her pulse quickened as the minutes ticked by. And then, just like clockwork, they appeared, the same masked figures, standing at the edge of her yard, perfectly still, silent as death. But tonight was different. Tonight, Olivia didn't hide. She didn't turn away. She watched them from behind the curtains, her eyes never leaving their figures. The clock on her wall ticked loudly in the background as she observed, her mind racing. She couldn't understand it. They never moved, never did anything but stand. That was until the moment her eyes snapped wide open in terror. One of them moved. It wasn't a large movement, just a slight tilt of the head, as though it had been aware of her presence all along. But the sudden shift in posture was enough to send a cold sweat down Olivia's back. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding against her ribs. Something was horribly wrong. Had they been waiting for her to look away? Had they been watching her this entire time? And then, to her horror, it happened. When she finally dared to turn her gaze back to the front yard, they were gone. And yet, she wasn't alone. The next few nights, Olivia tried to convince herself that what she had seen wasn't real. Maybe her mind had been playing tricks on her. Maybe the figures outside her window had simply been a trick of the shadows, a figment of her tired imagination. But the nagging fear wouldn't leave her. She couldn't shake the images of those blank white faces, those hollow eyes that had stared at her so intently. Something about it felt like more than just a strange coincidence. Each evening, she watched them, there, in the same spots, unmoving, unblinking. She counted them, though it was difficult to be certain. Sometimes there were 3, other times 5, but they were always there, in the same quiet, unsettling positions, never a sound, never a motion. Olivia's every instinct screamed at her to do something, anything, but she was paralyzed. She had no idea what to do, where to turn. Who would believe her? Her friends had suggested she call the police, but how could she explain the situation? That she saw masked figures standing outside her house night after night. The authorities would likely laugh her off or dismiss it as some harmless prank. But Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. It was as if they were watching her, waiting for something. But what? As the days passed, the dread that had once been an occasional whisper in the back of her mind grew into a constant, suffocating weight. It followed her everywhere. When she went to work, it lingered over her as though she were being followed. When she came home at night, she had to steel herself before even looking out the window. Even the silence of the house seemed oppressive, the stillness of it mirroring the unmoving figures in the yard. She tried to tell herself it was just her anxiety, something in her mind making a small problem seem much larger, but the fear was real. It felt real. Every night, she would check her windows and doors, locking them one by one, triple-checking that no one could get inside. But there was no escaping the truth. No matter how many locks or bolts she added, the sensation of being watched never left. She even tried calling a friend, Marie, and asking her to stay over for a few nights. But when Marie arrived, she looked at the house and asked if everything was all right. Olivia explained her fears, but Marie simply shrugged it off, suggesting that Olivia was letting her imagination get the best of her. Still, Marie stayed the night. The two of them watched TV in the living room, talking quietly, but the conversation was forced. Neither of them felt truly comfortable. That night, as Olivia lay awake in bed, she thought she saw the figures again. Through the faint light of the street lamp, they were there, standing in the same places. She barely dared to move, frozen beneath the covers, her heart racing as she listened to the sound of her breath in the darkness. And then something strange happened. One of them tilted its head just slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It was enough to make Olivia's blood run cold. It wasn't just standing still anymore. It had reacted to her. She gripped the sheets tightly, her mind racing with questions. What was happening? Who were these people? Why were they here? And why hadn't they left? But the fear she felt soon turned to something else, something darker. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something like a primal understanding and awareness that grew slowly over the next few nights. The figures were never going to leave. They had come for something, and Olivia didn't know what it was. But she couldn't shake the sense that whatever they wanted, they would get. The days began to bleed into one another. Olivia found herself looking over her shoulder, feeling the weight of their presence constantly pressing in on her. She had never felt so trapped, so vulnerable. There was nowhere to go. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't rest. She couldn't even leave the house without feeling like they were waiting for her, watching her from the shadows. Even when she closed her eyes, she could still feel their eyes on her, those hollow, faceless stares that seemed to follow her no matter where she went. By the time the next weekend arrived, Olivia's nerves were frayed, her mind on the brink of unraveling. She had started to dread the evenings, dreading the moment when the darkness would descend and the figures would reappear. There was no escaping them, no escaping the feeling that they were always just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to move. Then came the night when it all escalated. Olivia was sitting on her couch, her eyes flicking nervously to the window as she tried to focus on her phone. She had almost convinced herself that she wasn't being watched tonight, that maybe the figures had finally gone away. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the familiar feeling crept back into her chest, tightening her throat and sending chills down her spine. She couldn't take it anymore. With a shaking hand, she reached for the curtains, pulling them aside just enough to peer out into the yard. And there they were. At the far edge of her lawn, barely visible in the dim light, were the figures, standing perfectly still, just as they always did. But tonight, something was different. One of them was closer than it had ever been before. It stood near her porch, only a few feet away from the window, just behind the shadow of the tree that lined the yard. She could feel her heart race in her chest. For a moment, she thought it might be the wind, or perhaps the low branches of the tree shifting in the breeze. But no, this figure was standing too still, too close. Olivia backed away from the window, her breath shallow and fast. She moved quietly across the room, retreating into the kitchen. Her finger trembled as she grabbed a knife from the drawer, though she didn't know why. What could a knife possibly do against these figures, these strange, silent watchers? But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to do something. She had to confront this once and for all. With the knife in hand, she crept back to the living room, her footsteps nearly silent on the wooden floors. She tried to gather her thoughts, to steady her shaking hands, but the fear was overwhelming. Every instinct told her to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But she was too scared to leave. She was too scared to move. Then, just as she was about to look out the window again, she heard a soft creak. It came from behind her, slow and deliberate, like the sound of someone stepping carefully on the floorboards. Olivia froze. The knife dropped from her hand, clattering to the ground as her heart stopped. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she turned slowly toward the sound. The room was empty. The door to the hallway was open, the shadow of the frame stretching out like a dark tunnel. And through the doorway, she saw a shape standing just beyond the edge of her sight. A figure, tall and silent, unmoving in the dark. It was one of them. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen in place. The figure in the doorway remained motionless, its white mask staring back at her from the shadows. Her heart beat so loudly that it drowned out the silence of the room. She could feel her pulse in her temples, her legs shaking beneath her as if they might give way at any moment. The knife lay forgotten on the floor, its blade gleaming faintly in the dim light from the living room. For a moment, nothing happened. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, as still as the others, as though it had been there all along, watching her. Olivia couldn't move. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was paralyzed by fear. She tried to tell herself it was just her mind playing tricks. Maybe the darkness was making things worse than they were. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. There was no way this could be a trick. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow, deliberate. Each step it took seemed to echo in the empty house, the sound reverberating through the stillness. Olivia's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that she could use to defend herself. But there was nothing. The figure was too close now. She could feel the heat of its presence, the coldness radiating from it, as if the air itself had grown heavier with each passing second. She took a step back, but it was too late. The figure lunged forward, its long gloved hand reaching out to grab her wrist with inhuman strength. Olivia gasped as she was yanked toward the doorway, the figure's grip tightening around her arm. Her mind raced, desperate for a way to escape, but there was no escape. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figure pulled her down the hallway, its pace unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world. Olivia stumbled, her legs weak from the shock and her mind spinning with panic. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure didn't say a word. It didn't need to. The mask, that blank, emotionless face, was all it needed to convey its intent. They reached the stairs, and Olivia felt herself being dragged upwards. Each step felt like it took an eternity, the weight of the figure's presence pressing down on her as though it were a living thing. She wanted to fight, to struggle, but she couldn't summon the strength. Fear paralyzed her. She could barely think, her thoughts a jumbled mess of terror and disbelief. When they reached the top of the stairs, the figure finally stopped. Olivia was thrown onto the cold floor, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she tried to push herself up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She was too weak, too frightened. The figure stood over her, its face still hidden behind the mask. Olivia couldn't make sense of it. Why was it here? What did it want from her? Was this the end? Then, to her horror, she noticed something else. More figures were emerging from the shadows, their tall, motionless forms stepping out from the dark corners of the hallway. There were more of them than she had ever seen before, at least a dozen. They surrounded her, their presence suffocating, as though the very air in the room had grown thick and oppressive. She tried to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. There was no one to help her. There was no escape. The first figure leaned down, its cold, gloved hand reaching for her face. Olivia recoiled instinctively, but the figure's grip tightened, forcing her to look up. The mask was so close now that she could almost feel the emptiness behind it. There was nothing, nothing behind the eyes, no soul, no emotion. It was just an empty shell, a faceless thing that existed only to watch. She closed her eyes, unable to bear the weight of the stare any longer, but the figure wouldn't let her. It lifted her chin, forcing her to meet its gaze, and then something changed. The mask, so cold, so lifeless, began to crack. It was subtle at first, just a small fissure at the edge of one of the eyes. But then it spread, growing wider until the entire mask shattered with a sharp, deafening sound. Olivia flinched, her heart racing as the pieces of the mask fell away, revealing what lay beneath. At first, she couldn't comprehend it. The figure's face was not human. It was something otherworldly, pale, featureless, and smooth, with no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just a blank, smooth expanse of skin. It was like staring into an abyss, a void that seemed to suck away everything around it. But then, something darker took shape. The face, if it could even be called that, began to form into something more familiar. A grotesque parody of a human face appeared before her, twisted and malformed. Eyes that weren't eyes at all, but deep black voids that seemed to pull at her very soul. A mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, jagged and sharp, full of teeth that seemed to stretch and curl in ways they shouldn't. Olivia gasped, recoiling in horror, but the figure held her firm. Its grin widened, and for the first time, it spoke. Not in words, but in a sound that was more like a low, guttural hum, like the sound of something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries. It was a noise that reverberated deep in her bones, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the very core of her being. The other figures began to circle around her, their movements unnervingly synchronized. They weren't human, not in the way she had once thought. They were something else, something dark, something that shouldn't exist in this world. The figure's hands tightened around her wrist again, pulling her up, forcing her to her feet. Her vision blurred, her head spinning, but she knew now. She knew what they were. She had been chosen. The others stepped back, giving the first figure space as it took a step closer, its empty, hollow eyes boring into hers. She could feel it now, that coldness, that deep, crushing emptiness radiating from the figure. She felt it like a weight on her chest, like it was trying to crush her spirit, to extinguish her very soul. But then, just as the figure reached out, its fingers brushing against her cheek, Olivia did the only thing she could think of. She screamed, not in terror, but in defiance. A raw, primal scream that seemed to shake the walls of the house, to shake the very ground beneath her feet. The sound tore through the room, ripping apart the silence that had held it captive for so long. For a moment, the figure faltered. The others seemed to hesitate, their stillness broken by the power of her scream, the maskless face twisted in confusion, and for the first time, Olivia saw something like fear in its featureless eyes. And then, everything changed. The world seemed to shift around her. The shadows in the room were growing deeper, darker. The figures began to falter, their forms blurring, fading into the darkness. Olivia's vision grew clearer, her senses sharpening as the weight on her chest began to lift. The figures recoiled, their bodies warping and distorting like smoke being blown away in the wind. And just like that, they were gone. Olivia stood in the silence, the room now eerily still, as though the figures had never been there at all. Her body shook with adrenaline, her mind reeling from what had just happened. She could still hear the echo of her scream in her ears, the sound of it lingering in the air like a force that had pushed back the darkness. But Even as the figures vanished into nothingness, Olivia knew it wasn't over. They were gone, for now, but they would return. She didn't know when, she didn't know how, but the darkness they carried with them would never truly be gone. It would always be waiting just out of reach, lurking in the shadows. And Olivia knew deep in her bones that no matter how far she ran, no matter where she went, they would always find her. The masks would always return, and they would always watch.